Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 29th of September. We're looking at important updates beginning with Vuhledar moving northeastwards to Selydove, west of Andriivka, Selydove, as we said before, in addition to Pokrovsk. We'll move northwards to Chasiv Yar and finish off with the Kursk operation. We have changes in most of those fronts, but around Vuhledar in terms of concrete territorial shifts, I don't have any since my last video 48 hours ago about the battle here. But just to zoom in, it appears that the Russians are doing everything in their ability not to go in headfirst into Vuhledar and clear out every single apartment individually. You could tell that based on the structure of the way they've been putting pressure on Vuhledar from the flanks, which we'll talk about in detail in a second. But as you can see, they do have the foothold. That foothold is important because it gives direct pressure to the Ukrainians that remain in the apartment buildings. And it's essentially an incentive that they will not be able to go out if they step out of those apartment buildings, and they will immediately be fired upon, not only from long-range assets like drones or artillery garrisons, but also directly from Russian troops that have their outposts set up over here. And so for the most part, you have entire Ukrainian squads that are hiding under those basements and are suffering from constant bombardment, but it's not enough to actually completely kill off those squads. So they're still over there. And the Russian intention is to try to force them to surrender. They would not want to go in and individually destroy every single, I guess you could say, post where they're located, because then it extends the fighting even more and it leads to higher casualties. And in terms of casualties, the Russians have been able to avert much higher numbers that could have been seen if it was just a head-on assault. You could tell that based on the lack of footage confirming any casualties of Russian soldiers from their vehicular assaults that occurred west of Vuhledar, and also to a lesser extent northeast of the town, although there were more videos published showing that. Many of those came from earlier stages in the shaping operations throughout the past half year, and not many of them from the eventual culmination in galvanization by the Russian forces that occurred over the past couple of weeks, when we have not seen a significant uptake, a significant amount of vehicular losses or troops being killed in those vehicles, simply not because of the pace in which the armored assaults occurred, how swiftly they were able to take over territory, including villages like Vodiane, mines like the Yuzhno Donbasskaya mine and Pivden Donbasskaya mine. Those were taken over in such a manner that the Ukrainians did not have the ability to quickly respond and destroy every single resource involved with that. So the Russians, as a result, they still maintain a steady offensive fighting force that can continue to put pressure from the flanks. But again, it is their preference not to go in directly, and that's why we're seeing this sort of stalemate on the front line at the moment. But definitely the Russians are making efforts to gesture the Ukrainians here to surrender. They have spent the past couple of days discussing that, dropping leaflets. Tonight, Russian sources are talking about giving the Ukrainian garrison here one more opportunity to surrender before they go in and begin to clear out the apartments. Remember that a lot of them can be mined, booby-trapped, so there is a huge fear, and they have to act with caution. In terms of the size of the Ukrainian garrison, this is no consensus about this, because some say that it ranges from 200 to 800 or even more than that. I would lean towards the smaller number of 200, because simply 800 would be a full battalion, and having that in one town at this present moment just seems completely not realistic in my eyes. But again, even 200 troops here is a rather large number of infantry that are needed to hold the line and would be useful for, tertiary, secondary layers further back and for defense of future areas like Vuhledar. So even losing them, whether it be in a prisoner swap or in an attempted escape that leads to high casualties, that will also have reverberations for the entire 72nd Mechanized Brigade, as they will suffer huge losses within some of their companies defending here. And they're one of the main units that are relied upon to defend in this theater. So I'll have to see if that changes after Vuhledar ends up eventually falling and the nexus of fighting a lot of the focal point shifts to Vuhledar. We have already seen some of that shift with territorial defense battalions coming in and beefing up the defenses within Vuhledar, but again, the primary fighting force is still the 72nd. Besides that, you do have other Ukrainian units that are assisting with the flanks. 58th, for instance, that's a unit that's supposed to be defending in the Prechestivka area. They really were found out when the Russians broke through in this region, and that sort of led to a domino fall of events that led to the Russian capture of this airstrip, of the water facility, etc. You have here the 36th Rifle Battalion, just a detached unit that is involved in plugging holes, you could say, in the Ukrainian defense. So they've been involved in Vuhledar, presumably, And then to the northeast, you have 61st Mechanized Brigade. They were recently pushed back from positions directly south of Andriivka, which is located over here. And just to zoom in and confirm that, we have this video that was released on the 28th of September by the 39th Motor Rifle Brigade, really important Russian unit for the capture of Novomikhailivka, Konstantinivka, and fields south of it. They have a very strong armored component. So their columns, they overran a tree line where you had a trench built, and they took 3 Ukrainians POW. That is just confirmation of earlier Russian advances that we marked in this particular area. Interestingly, over the past 24 hours, the fire maps showing the existing fires don't show that many from Vuhledar. There are a few very minor ones near the eastern portion where the gray zone is currently located, but not at the same scale of the massive bombardment that we saw earlier this week. What we do have is Russian bombardments targeting Ukrainian rear posts, probably ones that are being sent in not to go back into Vuhledar, but perhaps to set up new defensive positions and prepare for the eventual withdrawal to the fields, trenches around Vuhledar, and also more generally to the Uspanivsk area. So you had Russian strikes, artillery strikes, and drone strikes on the Selydove region, and also on more generally the chain of villages that connects to Konstantinivka going southeastwards. Now let's move to the Pokrovsk/Selydove fronts, where we've seen a cacophony of events over the past 2 days. Let's zoom in and begin with the southernmost section. So Hirnik, this is an area where Russian DRGs are operating around the northern outskirts, but it's very clear they're not going to attack head first right now. They're doing everything to avoid that by going from the western flank. So for now, the Ukrainian garrison in the center, they are safe, and this includes elements of territorial defense units that you see marked on the map. I have very specific unit locations for each one over here. You have certain battalions of the 59th Brigade, for instance, and also the infamous 68th Jaeger Brigade, which has been really involved as a backbone of Ukrainian defense ever since we were fighting even east of the Vovcha River. But just to look at where the Russians are advancing through and why it's important, it's in this wedge area between Hirnik and Surkunia, along the rail line area where you have the windbreaks. And so, according to Ukrainian sources and Russian sources alike, they've been able to make it to St. Basil mine over here. It's a large facility. You have these 2 elevated areas and these nearby quarries. So it is a large industrial facility that is right next to the windbreak. So those windbreaks are, of course, densely forested. It's a great position to defend. So the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to it by any means necessary at the moment. But the Russians, they've made it a goal of theirs to take over this local connection, which serves as a conduit between Surkunia and Hirnik, as I said. And that will give the Russians an amazing boost on a local level to overlook the surrounding regions, but also to then advance further from there. You have a local trench in the region connected to the windbreaks, which is now considered a part of the gray zone. So as you can see, this vector, which would then eventually cross over and take over the entirety of St. Basil mine, then you have this open field area, which is just an area that is free for Russian columns to advance through until they reach a rear target several kilometers southwards. The intention would be to sever the connection between Hirnik and this western field, which then extends westwards to the entire Ukrainian rear in Donetsk Oblast. And this wouldn't put Hirnik into a complete encirclement, because if you go southwards, there are still routes that are, more dangerous in the sense, because you'd have to go through Kurakivka and then Vovchenka and then extend outwards near the Vovcha River and the reservoir. And at that point, you're going through areas that don't include many paved roads and are also generally on open fields exposed to Russian artillery. But it would, of course, put a lot of local pressure just from a flanking perspective, but also then you would be able to cut off some key supply lines that are shorter in nature. So as you guys can see, the goal really is to push through this axis, put some pressure from the north, but not anything too significant along this arrow over here. And from there, you put on the pressure needed to squeeze out the Ukrainians from Hirnik in ways that will be similar to a lot of other similar sized towns where we didn't see that much significant fighting. Andriivka is an example, for instance. It really is not a perfect example, but in the sense that you did have an important vector towards Andriivka from the eastern entrance to that town, and then a southern flank that played a big role in eventually overcoming the Ukrainian frontal defenses. I guess you could sort of see how that may be mimicked in a large town like Hirnik. But just to move on from that, I want to look at north of Turkunia, because this village is very important. simply because of how it acts as a glue between the wider Ukrainian garrisons in Selydove and northwards of that, and then southwards with a lot of the Ukrainian units that were involved in the withdrawal from the Vavcha River salient. And so that's why the Russians are putting so much pressure on it. It's currently being enveloped from three sides. First of all, the one over here where they captured 2.2 square kilometers, the Russians. Also from the north, this is where we're seeing a lot of footage come out of armored assaults conducted by, BMD-2s, tanks, BTRs, etc. And definitely the Ukrainians have had some success in repelling them and causing damage to Russian vehicles, trying to secure very large swaths of territory that we're going to get into in a second. Let's see which videos are recent. I want to click on the most recent ones here. So these ones are from September 25th. The one that I want to mention specifically is over here. So this is from the 2nd National Guard Battalion of the 15th Brigade. They have a Javelin crew who destroyed a BMP-1AM, Busumarmanim, and that is an upgraded version of the BMP-1 that the Russians utilized. And so it was able to make it all the way to the windbreak over here south of Selydove before it was encountered by a local squad, anti-tank squad, that destroyed the vehicle. Again, it's a rather small advance, but it is, again, in the direction of the rail line. So they're utilizing the actual routes and the windbreaks as support to knock on the southern footsteps of Selydove. In the process also, due to all these vehicles paving the way for then future Russian consolidation, a lot of these higher elevated regions south of Selydove are slowly but surely falling under Russian control, which means that they'll be able to directly overlook every single Ukrainian position near the Solona River Valley where Selydove itself, the city, is located. So not only will you have a southern flank to sort of push through, but also you're going to be able to overlook a lot of the Ukrainian defenders and the sort of logistics that enter into the city. So that's really big news. Here's a video from September 27th. Again, 15th National Guard Brigade repels an armored assault. 1 tank and 2 BMPs were destroyed in that operation, a combination of mostly FPVs. And the 15th Brigade, they are in control of this operational sector in southern Selydove and also in the fields located nearby. So they've been involved with spotting them. They're working with their drone crews to do so, and then also sometimes fixing artillery strikes. The Russians are taking advantage of this route, which is paved with a road, and it's also near some tree lines that feed directly into Selydove. So it's understandable why they're trying to push through here, because if they were able to achieve a breakthrough with a certain amount of columns pushing through, then they'd be able to sort of build off of that and get control over the broader area of the southern suburbs. So far, that has not happened, but what we do know as a result of these geolocations is that the Ukrainians do not have solid control over many of these positions that they really do need to secure on Selydove's southern perimeter. So now there's a question about what they really have control over. I'd say that their sort of strongholds include the actual buildings and structures in the southern outskirts, and then perhaps some of these trenches. We don't know if they're still manned by any sort of significant Ukrainian force, but for now, I'm still marking them as blue. Now, to move a bit northwards here, we have additional footage and reports from the Ukrainian side indicating a Russian advance of 7.4 square kilometers westwards. And this is a part of shaping operations to attack the northern flank of Selydove. So again, Russians, they understood that the Ukrainians were able to consolidate in the center and also in the eastern outskirts of the city. They have been able to accept that that's not going to be the route through which they take that city. And so they're working on shaping the flanks with a lot of success in the south, and now also beginning to culminate in the north with an advance of 1.8 kilometers in that direction. So we have some videos from Andriivka confirming full Russian control over that region. So here's a video from September 29th. It shows the Russians conducting 10 evacuations with vehicles. And this was of, wounded personnel, taking troops out of the front line and also delivering ammo to the actual troops that remain at the line of contact, engaging with Ukrainian soldiers. And all of these movements back and forth were done under continuous Ukrainian fire, indicating that this area really is still a heated war zone. But this really is important because it means that the Russians are getting control over additional tree lines, not really fortified in any way, but they are still important for foliage. Important also because of this local slag heap that was taken over, one of the final outskirt positions near Vuhledar, which we didn't know if it was under Ukrainian control or in a gray zone, now fully solidified by Russia and will be utilized to, further bombard the positions along the E50 highway that the Ukrainians control. You have this very large open region, which could be further exploited in the future. But for now, also, you have to look southwards and see how a lot of the pressure could begin to be put onto northern Selydove and what remains of their control of this mine, this slag heap, which really is one of the things Ukraine could take solace in, the fact that they still maintain control over this local height. But it could come crashing down if the Russian pressure becomes too great and they actually are able to approach it physically from the north. In terms of troop rotations, the Russians moved in the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade from Kherson. It's been stationed there for probably a year and a half or even more. It's just an insane amount. And during that time period, it did not suffer any significant casualties simply because it was not a heated area. Throughout 2022, 2020, or 2023 and 2024, now with size, which is probably between 4,000 to 5,000, those men are going to be operating here. They've already been thrown into the deep end, and there's videos of their BTRs being destroyed near Vuhledar. So we know they're actually engaged over here, and they will be involved in all likelihood with these breakthroughs that's being attempted just west of Vuhledar, and also perhaps with operations northwards in Krasny Yar. So now let's go to Krasny Yar and zoom in for a second. You guys can see that the Russians have been able to take over additional portions of the village as they approach the second to last line of defense before reaching Pokrovsk itself. It's 0.6 square kilometers and now only leaves a very small portion of the village in a gray zone. Here you can see the actual geolocation. It's from the 71st Jaeger Brigade. They dropped grenades onto Russian troops that entered in very small squads because, again, this is extremely dangerous. Most of the village is in ruins and it's completely dominated by air coverage of Ukrainian drones. So they are taking their time in trying to go in small forces, but nonetheless, there is a presence of them known here based on the fact that the Ukrainians spotted them and dropped grenades onto them. It's basically an admission that the Russians have been able to advance deeper, but of course, in the process, when you're going through a gray zone, the Ukrainians are able to inflict casualties on the advancers. And then the question is whether the Ukrainian troops that retreated, they still have some sort of position in this trench region or in some of the nearby strongholds. Because the next step for the Russians after solidifying control of these houses would be to then advance westwards and begin to undermine the line of defense itself. Now, looking south of Chasiv Yar, we have a small geolocation which really makes us think whether the Russians actually have full control now of Andriivka. So it's from September, 29th, from the Signum Battalion, which is a part of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. If you recall, I said that their elements, one half of the unit was moved away from the area south of Chasiv Yar towards Pokrovsk. What appears in not its entirety, because you still have this one drone unit that is operating as a part of the 93rd Brigade and may have been detached and has been called upon to stay here. That's very important because that unit, Signum specifically, is really well experienced with the region, very deep knowledge of the terrain and the different dynamics, basically, and they have very strong FPV arsenal. So it's good from a Ukrainian standpoint that they were not moved away to Pokrovsk and that they continue to be here and involved with defensive activities as the Russians begin to take control over additional territory east of the Donbass Canal. So in this video, you had two Russian soldiers that were making it into basically the deep end, as you could call it, areas that are in a gray zone like Andriivka and surrounding fields. They entered into an abandoned BMP-2, and that's when they were spotted by the drone. The drone struck them while they were inside and set it on fire. So that's confirmation the Russian squads in very small quantities are actually operating around here. And it's the first movement we've seen near the Andriivka region, which could imply there were efforts out by the Russians to clear out some of these holdouts, which include open fields and local trenches east of the canal. Now, in relation to Kursk, we have two updates. First of all, in relation to Russian advances, we have a slight one over here in the direction of Nikolaevo, Darino. It amounts to 1.1 square kilometers. This is based on the video from the Ukrainian side that was released September 27th of their Dragon drone. It dispersed thermite onto a really dense tree line that is pretty close to the border and would serve as a vector through which to then advance to an even denser portion of forestry. And then from there, it basically leads into the village itself. So we don't know if the Russians actually took it over because some Russian sources were alleging basically a week ago that they were successful in that embarkation. And I never changed the map because there was never any sort of proof from the Ukrainian side or from videos to back it up. And now we're seeing some sort of Ukrainian response to activities going on a couple of kilometers westwards. So we'll have to wait and see if there's any larger movement. But this is a step in the right direction for the Russian side. Then again, there are a lot of questions about the direct status of some of these positions near the border because, again, the Ukrainians are on the Sumy side and the Russians are on the Kursk side. So we don't know if Uspanovska has been taken over yet by the Russians, along with some nearby forested areas. Now, to go a bit to the west towards the Ukrainian Glushkovo vector, over here we have two changes that are interesting. First of all, here we have this video from September 20th to 25th. We don't know exactly when it was recorded, but it shows a combined effort by the Korn Group, the 225th Assault Battalion, 33rd Rifle Battalion, and 21st Mechanized Brigades. They utilized FPVs, artillery, and a grenade launcher from the 21st Brigade to destroy two Russian vehicles. I think one of them was a BMD and another a tank, and this is just south of Veseloy. This is interesting because on September 19th, that's when you had a very deep Ukrainian penetration that was repelled by Russian troops along the route leading directly to Glushkovo. If you zoom out, you'll see it. So the Russians were able to contain that, their Marine Brigade, and then they went on the counterattack probably a couple of days later. And that counterattack was able to retake a large portion of fields that are just southeast of Veseloy. But at a certain point in time, they were spotted by the Ukrainian side, and some of the vehicles were damaged and destroyed. Now, since then, there's been no additional indication that the Ukrainians have turned the tide and have been able to conduct this vector, like sort of exploit it, in the sense that you have this open area that doesn't really pass through any villages and then leads directly through a paved road to Glushkovo, basically the perfect arena for the Ukrainians to advance through for their objectives here. But due to the presence of the Marine Brigade, 155th, then they've not been able to do that. Instead, they put more effort into taking Vesely directly, and they may have done that, although this is a bit sort of preemptive, I would say, because even Ukrainian sources, they're claiming that Veseloy in its entirety is in the gray zone and not under their full control as of now. Of course, it could change. But let's just look at the video for a second. September 29th, Russian artillery destroyed two Ukrainian vehicles that are located just at the northern tip and also to the northwest of Veseloy. So based on the location of this video, it would appear that they were able to enter into Veseloy and then make it all the way to the northern outskirts before being targeted by Russian artillery, and then also sort of branched out to the northwest to take over additional tree lines. That's my interpretation of it, but there isn't actually footage of Ukrainian troops within the village itself. So for now, we'll have to wait and see whether it was directly through the village or if it was sort of a bypassing method from either side. That's something that we still don't know yet. But again, it does show that there has been sort of a culmination, a sort of manifestation of the Ukrainian efforts that have been ongoing, if not for 2 weeks, that try to overrun the Russian defenses here in Obuchovka and Veseloy, which really were non-existent before the Ukrainians opened up their front over here. And so the Russians didn't have much to work with. They only had the garrison that is nearby that was involved in attacks, 155th, and it had to be partially rediverted to hold the line and contain a large garrison of Ukrainian forces involved with offensive activities. Also, you have some other Russian units involved, most notably some Akhmat units and probably some air assault units, but they are mainly involved with the actual pushing that is occurring just to the southeast, you could say, of Koranovo. And so, yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.